Though I'm a huge proponent for continuing to practice our drawing and sketching skills, I think that as painters, it is very helpful to have one or two strategies that we can use to transfer outline sketches onto our painting substrates, whether it's watercolor paper or something else. Why? Because sometimes you may want to focus on the painting aspects and focus on developing your painting techniques for a certain piece, and you want to simplify and speed up the drawing part of the process, right? And that is perfectly fine. Other times you might find that drawing that particular type of subject, maybe it's a portrait or an animal, something like that, that requires very specific proportions. Maybe it's something that you've never tried to draw before. And in those cases, I think it's important to trace over a photo or trace over a freehand sketch that you've created in a separate sketchbook so that you can avoid erasing too much on your watercolor paper and maybe even damaging it. So in this week's video, I'm going to be explaining how I use tracing paper to transfer my outline sketches and prepare those drawings prior to starting with the watercolor painting. And in next week's video, I'm going to be explaining how I use a light board to do the same thing. For the longest time, I just used tracing paper for transferring my drawings, and I still do. It's still my preference when I'm going to be painting certain kinds of subjects. I know that it entails a bit of a longer process, but it is still a great method to use. And also, a lot of people don't have light boards, and so I wanted to make sure to share both methods. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. To do your transferring using tracing paper, there are a few different supplies that you're going to need. First of all, if you're going to be tracing over a photograph, you need to have that photograph printed out. Sometimes I create my preliminary sketch freehand in a sketchbook and I trace over my sketch. Other times I trace over a photo. Whatever it is, you're going to need that image or that sketch that you're going to trace over. You're going to need a sheet of tracing paper. I like having two different pencil grades on hand, a 2B pencil and an HB pencil. I'll explain why in just a bit. I have both a regular soft graphite eraser and a kneaded eraser, as well as a sharpener, and of course the watercolor sheet that I'm going to be transferring onto. It's also helpful to have a scrap piece of paper on hand. I'll explain why in just a bit. Right here you can see my watercolor sheet that's already been taped onto my backing board. I do make sure to run my pieces of masking tape over my clothes 3 to 4 times before using it on my watercolor paper in order to soften that adhesive and make it less likely that I'll damage my watercolor paper at the end when I remove it. Alright, so with the supplies out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with step 1, which is going to be to trace over the first side of our tracing paper. I like placing at least one scrap piece of paper beneath my photograph or beneath my sketch that I'm going to be tracing over. And this is so that I don't damage my watercolor paper in any way or get it dirty. If you want to, you can definitely set your watercolor sheet that you've taped onto your backing board aside for now because you don't even really need it for this part of the process. Alright, so with my watercolor sheet protected, what I am doing right here is I am using my 2B pencil to trace over my image. I am using a 2B pencil because it has a relatively soft graphite at its core. And this is going to enable me to deposit a good amount of graphite on my tracing paper as I'm doing my tracing, which is important because if I don't have enough graphite on my tracing paper, I'm not going to be able to transfer that graphite onto my sheet of watercolor paper. If you don't know about different drawing pencil grades and what they are for or how they can come in handy throughout the drawing or the sketching process, here's a quick little explanation for you. When you come across a drawing pencil, you're going to find that they have these little codes in them. They can have either 1 letter, 2 letters, or a letter and a number. You have your H pencils and you have your B pencils and you have the HB right smack in the middle. H stands for hard and B stands for bold or black. The higher the number before the H, the harder the graphite is. And the higher the number before the B, the softer the graphite is. So why is this helpful? When we're looking to create lighter, thinner, cleaner lines, we can reach for an H grade pencil. When we're looking to create smudgier, bolder, darker lines, we can reach for B pencils. When I am getting my graphite on my tracing paper, I want that graphite to be softer because that is going to enable me
to get more graphite on that tracing paper. However, when it comes to sketching on my watercolor paper directly, I like using a slightly harder pencil grade. I like going for an HB pencil. There are others that would use an H or even a 2H to trace right on their watercolor sheet. And this is because they're usually looking for lighter line work on their watercolor sheet, cleaner work, so that you're not able to see the pencil work through the paint at the end, and so that you're able to keep things nice and clean and not have so much graphite left on your watercolor paper that can smudge and dirty up your vibrant colors. So in part 4 of this process, when it comes to refining my sketch directly on my watercolor paper, you're gonna see me switch on over to my HB pencil. However, for the time being, as I am doing this tracing, I am using my 2B because I want to make sure that I have enough graphite on my tracing paper, because otherwise, if I were to use a harder pencil grade or I didn't go over everything very well, I'm not going to have enough graphite on my tracing paper in order to do my transferring, or the transferring is going to come out very, very light, or I'm going to be missing certain sections, etc. And alongside with using a softer pencil grade to do my tracing, I am also making sure to go over all of these shapes and lines kind of roughly. I'm not pressing down too hard because I don't want to damage or make holes in my tracing paper, but you can see how I am going over all of these lines kind of with back and forth motions. I'm not just going over them once and creating a clean line. I'm going over everything 2 to 3 times in a rougher way. This, in combination with using a softer pencil grade, is going to make it so that enough graphite is deposited on my tracing sheet. You're probably going to find that you have to sharpen your pencil along the way because you're doing all of this pretty roughly. This is to be expected, so just whenever you notice that your pencil starts becoming blunt, just go ahead and sharpen it. You can see me use my left hand to hold my tracing sheet in place as I am doing this tracing over my image. Every now and then I lift up my tracing sheet to notice whether I'm missing any lines or shapes that are important. Usually, I like making my way from larger shapes towards smaller shapes and details. All right, so right here, I am completely done with tracing over this first side of my tracing paper. I've even made sure to trace over the cast shadows that I'm able to see in that image. All right, so with that, let's move on to step number 2, which is going to be to trace on the opposite side of our tracing paper. So right here, you can see me get prepared by placing my scrap piece of paper under my tracing sheet. And this is important because the graphite that I've already placed on the opposite side of my tracing paper is going to get transferred onto this scrap piece of paper as I am doing the tracing on the opposite side. So if you work right on top of your watercolor sheet, that graphite is going to start getting transferred in the opposite direction to what you want. So you're going to transfer the flipped image. So here I am doing the exact same thing that I was doing before, only this time I am tracing over the opposite side, noticing the pencil work that I've already created on the first side. You can see how when you have graphite on the side that is facing up, that graphite shows shinier and darker. And the graphite that is on the opposite side of the tracing paper looks more matte and looks lighter. So if you have any lines or shapes that look matte and lighter, simply make sure to go over them so that you can ensure that you have graphite on both sides. I am still using my 2B pencil, my softer pencil grade that I chose for this process, and you can see me still go over everything kind of roughly with back and forth motions over everything. Still using my left hand to hold that tracing sheet in place as I am doing all of this and taking my time with the process. I do want to say that if you want to speed up the transferring process, you can skip this part of the process entirely by printing out your image or your photograph flipped in the opposite direction to what you actually want your final piece to be. So what I would do would be to open up my reference photo in a photo editing software like Photoshop or anything else like that, flip it in Photoshop, then print it in this flipped way. If you trace over the flipped image, then you really only have to trace over one side and you don't have to deposit that graphite on both sides of the tracing paper. I just finished tracing over side number 2, and as you can see, I now have graphite on both sides of my tracing paper. So I'd be able to transfer my sketch in whichever direction I want. I am now ready to get started with step number 3, which is the transferring process. So this is the point at which I'm actually placing my tracing paper directly on top of my watercolor paper. After making sure that my tracing paper was situated on my watercolor paper exactly where I wanted it, I took a couple of pieces of masking tape and taped my tracing paper in place. I like placing these little pieces of masking tape on the top corners because this way I can lift up the sheet at the bottom just to make sure that everything is transferring properly and that I'm not leaving out any important shapes or lines. It's the graphite on the side of the tracing paper that is coming into direct contact with the watercolor paper that is getting transferred. If I didn't have any graphite on the side of the tracing sheet that is directly coming into contact with the watercolor paper, nothing is going to get transferred. So this is why I need that graphite to be on the side that is directly coming into contact with the watercolor sheet. As I go over everything once again with my 2B pencil, the pressure that I am exerting on my pencil as I'm going over all of these shapes and lines is pressing that graphite on the opposite side of the sheet onto my watercolor paper, and that's how that graphite is getting transferred. I'm pressing that. And you can see me go over everything quite roughly again, not really trying to make holes in my tracing paper, but really going over everything roughly so that I can make sure that a good amount of graphite is getting deposited on my watercolor paper. All right, so I'm just finishing up here and I'm going to notice one last time if I have everything in. And as you can see, I managed to transfer all of the main shapes and lines onto my watercolor paper. It is now time to move on to step number 4. This is the final step in which we're going to be cleaning up our sketch and doing any refining that needs to get done. So this is the part of the process in which I switch on over to my HB drawing pencil, the slightly harder pencil grade that I am using for this process. The very first thing that I like doing is I like going over my entire sketch with my kneaded eraser. So you can see me gently tapping over the majority of my line work that has gotten transferred to lighten it and get rid of any unnecessary soft graphite that might be floating around on my watercolor sheet. Once I'm done with that, I am taking my HB pencil and I am simply completing lines that maybe didn't get transferred properly, adding any extra little small details that maybe also didn't get transferred properly, or I simply didn't decide to transfer because I would be adding them later, erasing out any lines that might have been transferred accidentally. Be very careful if you're using your hand to dust off those eraser bits after doing any erasing, because you might have graphite on your hand that can smudge and dirty up your watercolor sheet. Also remember that we have oils in our hands, and if you use lotion on your hands or anything like that, you definitely don't want to get that on your watercolor sheet. Because what's going to happen then is that once you start painting, that paint doesn't get absorbed the same way. It doesn't sit on that paper the same way if you got hand oils or lotion or anything like that on the paper, and this can lead to splotchiness and undesired effects. As I continue doing my refining of my sketch, I continue observing my reference photo closely and noticing if I'm missing any necessary pieces of information before getting started with the painting process. In this part of the process, if I want to, I can also start mapping out areas of highlights and darkest darks that I want to make happen in the painting process. So as I've been sharing with you in past classes, planning and protecting highlight areas is super important when painting with watercolor. So at the end of this process, you might want to take a quick second to notice where those brightest highlight shapes are in your reference photo. Understand where the light source is located in relation to your subject, understand where the darker values and cast shadow areas are, and map out any of these shapes that you might find helpful so that you can remember where these are. All of this is especially important if you're going for higher levels of realism in your painting. Just make sure that you do this lightly if you don't want your pencil work to show through your paint at the end. Drawing lightly is also going to help you easily erase mistakes. If you start drawing hard on your watercolor sheet, you're not going to be able to erase those mistakes as easily, and you might end up making things pretty messy. Alright, so I just finished up there by going over everything one last time with my kneaded eraser to make sure everything was clean and light. This sketch is now ready for us to get started with the painting process.